Now that we've spent some time in the High Renaissance, there is a question that we have to ask, and that's where do we go from here? What comes next? If you think about it, that first decade of the 16th century was remarkable. We go from 1501 to 1510, and there was just an explosion and a confluence of some of the greatest art and some of the greatest artists that have ever appeared on planet Earth ever. So you go from the last 2 years of the 15th century. You've got the Last Supper by Leonardo, and you've got the Mona Lisa painted a few years later. Then you've got the Pieta a year later. Then you've got David. Then you've got the painting of the Sistine Chapel, or the beginning of the painting of the Sistine Chapel. So many of these works of art that just crammed into one decade that really define the Renaissance, and that's the heart of what we call the High Renaissance. And if this is the height of the Renaissance, how can we exceed that? What comes next? A lot of art historians for years, for centuries, kind of looked at this next artistic movement and scoffed at it. Yeah, there's this thing that comes next. In many ways, it's similar. In many ways, it's very different. But it isn't worthy of the same praise that we heap on this period that we call the High Renaissance. So this artistic school that starts in places like Florence and Venice, that comes next, what we call mannerism, was like think of it as the bastard stepchild of High Renaissance art. More recently, we've come to appreciate it for its own nuance, and you're allowed to be fans of the Mannerist period. And some of the great artists of the 16th century and early 17th century are Mannerist artists themselves. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in this video talking about what makes Mannerism, and I'll show you a few examples of great Mannerist works of art, and you can decide for yourselves. So how do I know if, when I'm looking at a painting, is it Mannerism? And what is Mannerism? So we've spent a lot of this series talking about what makes Renaissance art. How is the culture of the Renaissance echoed in the great works of art? One of the things that makes Renaissance art so great, or one of the things that allows us to recognize brilliance in Renaissance art, is its concept of balance and its concept of harmony. Things like symmetry. And part of that is that Renaissance value of classicism. You know, the Greeks and the Romans saw value in and beauty in symmetry and composition. And so your great painters, your Leonardos and your Michelangelos will convey that in their works of art. Mannerism is going to take that idea and just dump it on its head and create something that's different and new, but also recognizable. So think of Mannerism as a reaction to the Renaissance, but also capturing some of the same style and some of the same essential elements of the Renaissance movement. By the time we get to the end of the Mannerist period, it starts to blend with the next great artistic movement, which is the Baroque style. And some of these artists, you will hear their names mentioned as both Mannerist painters and Baroque painters. You know, so like with any great artistic movement, it's sometimes one blends into the other, bleeds into the other. You know, some of the greatest artists in history painted in a number of different styles, worked in a number of milieu. But that could be said for any artist from any era. You know, you could say the same thing about Dali. You could say the same thing about Picasso. You could say the same thing about, you know, the Impressionists. Some of the Impressionists. So Um, that shouldn't be too. It's like a 20th century musician who did, I did rock and roll and did grunge, did rock and roll and then did disco. Same idea here. Finally, if you remember one thing about mannerism, there is one. I call it the mannerism hack. If you remember this one thing about mannerism, you will always be able to pick out a traditional mannerist style painting. So I will teach you that hack. Okay. First great mannerist painter that we're going to look at is Giacomo Pontormo. This is a painting called The Deposition. So very familiar topic for a painting. This is, well, really, it's one of two things, and we're not sure. And we're not sure what it is about because it is a mannerist painting. So stick with me for a second. So that central figure is Jesus. If we go to, this is a fresco done in one of those parish churches in Florence. The chapel was actually designed by the same guy who designed the dome on the Duomo, Brunelleschi. So you go into this beautiful little chapel designed by Brunelleschi, and you see this fresco. It's called The Deposition. So when we look at it, we're really not sure. Is this Jesus being taken down from the cross? Or is this Jesus being placed into the tomb? And the reason why we're not sure is because unlike Renaissance art, where the figures are anchored in some kind of a background, think Mona Lisa, there's nothing here in the physical world. There's no physical representation of something. Like, we're not sure if it's an actual deposition because we don't see a cross. We're not sure if it's an actual entombment because there's no tomb. This is simply bodies kind of floating in a way that's not necessarily natural. And that's the heart of mannerism. We throw away the composition, we throw away some of the linear perspective, we distort reality in order to convey emotion. Those of you who are more familiar with the Baroque period know that Baroque is going to take that to a whole new level. But here we are. We're doing little contortions of reality. So Pontormo's Christ being taken down from the cross. Here's another view of it. It's almost like the figures are floating. In traditional high Renaissance art, remember, we talked about the fresco of the Last Supper by Leonardo and how he uses geometry to set up linear perspective and to set up focal points. And then if we follow the tapestries and the empty space and the negative space, everything kind of steers our view towards Jesus's eye. Like we feel anchored in this painting. Here it is expressed geometrically. Here, there's nothing like that. It's almost like we feel disconnected because the figures seem to be, revolving in a way. Look at the figure on the very bottom. So Christ being taken down from the cross, he's being carried by that figure is probably Joseph of Arimathea. Look at how he's on his tiptoes. Like there's no way that he could support the weight of that body in the position that he's in. So why does Pontormo show him doing that? Like, why is he in that position? And I would argue it's to convey the emotion and uncertainty of the moment. This is supposed to be a religious experience. not necessarily something that's 100% realistic. Here's another great example of mannerism in art, and this is by the master Parmigianino. I'm going to tell you the name of the painting, but the name of the painting is the mannerism hack. So I want you to take a look at Jesus, the baby. Just take a look at his body and see if you can figure out something that's not right about it. Is there something about the body that's wrong? And then I'd like you to take a look at Mary. Is there something about Mary that isn't right physically? How about now? So this painting is known to us as Madonna of the Long Neck. Does Mary's neck look unnatural to you? Well, it should. So there's no human being with a neck like that. To convey the message, what mannerists will sometimes do, what people who do mannerism in art will do, is stretch out the body. So if you're looking at a painting and you're thinking, wow, that looks like a Renaissance piece of art, but man, the arms and legs are so long, or the torso is unnaturally long, or the neck is unnaturally long, then you may be looking at mannerism. People like Da Vinci and Michelangelo used to study cadavers. I mean, they were slavishly obsessed with the human body, and the human body's the way that there were mathematical proportions between different body parts. Think of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Well, the mannerists aren't really doing that, are they? It's something new and exciting. Here is Parmigianino's Cupid, and this is a little unsettling to me. You know, when I see the wings, I think immediately of Madonna of the Rocks. But there's something disconnected between the head of that Cupid and the body of the Cupid. It's almost like that carnival game that you used to play when you were a kid, where you spin the body and you spin the head, and the body doesn't match the head. You get like a clown's head on a fireman's body or something. It's like the body of Cupid here doesn't match the head of Cupid. The greatest of all the Mannerist painters is this guy, Tintoretto. So to see his work, we have to go to Venice. This fresco was done at the Church of San Rocco, the Church of Saint Roch. Saint Roch is the patron saint who looks out for you if you are infected with a disease or infected with plague. And if you'll think back to our video on the plague and how the plague affected pre-Renaissance Europe, Venice, because of its position as the trade entrepot that overlooks both the East and the West, this kind of international trading city, was struck by the plague over and over again. Yes, in 1346, but again and again and again. So Tintoretto, who finishes this work in 1565, is doing it as an homage to the church, and dedicated and actually donated most of these paintings to the church. But just a fascinating example of mannerism. So how do we know it's mannerist? Well, we can take a look at a few things. One, let's look at Jesus's arms. So this effect, this stretchy effect, where his arms are unnaturally long, is done for an artistic effect. You know, Jesus's arms stretch out over the painting in the same way that the artist wants to tell us that Jesus stretches out and protects humanity and has died to redeem the sins of humanity. And this sunburst or halo behind him has the same effect as a halo or even wings, it's been suggested. So it's the arms of Christ, but it's also, let's take a look at the cross itself. Look how unnaturally long all three crosses that we can see in this fresco are. That has a particularly Venetian quality to it, I think. You know, the Venetians, after all, built their city on these lagoons, and some of these artificial parts of the lagoons are made by driving big, long pilings into the mud, and so a Venetian would have needed that piling to be really long as the crosses are unnaturally long, like the crosses are in this scene. If we look at some of the clothing and some of the headdresses specifically, we can see the Venetian influence because they're wearing outfits like you would see in Venice in the 16th century. There is Christ stretching his arms. We see the headgear and headwear you might see on some of the foreign traders or Arab traders, or even some of the Italian traders coming and going through the streets of Venice. Tintoretto himself, interesting character. He was a contemporary of Titian, the other great Venetian master that I mentioned. Titian was a little bit older than Tintoretto. There's a story. It's apocryphal. It definitely didn't happen, but it's too good a story not to tell. Apparently, Tintoretto was a student of Titian for all of 10 days, and then Titian threw him out of the school for being too good. Some of the people in this painting are behaving as though it's just a normal execution. Some people are struck by the gravity of the moment. Um, Here we are. We see some of the workers toiling to dig a hole and appropriately place that elongated cross. When we get to the Baroque era, Caravaggio is going to take this idea and just turn it on its head and make it all about the emotion and the physical toil of putting Christ on the cross and then taking Christ down from the cross. But for now, the mannerists are where we're at. So, Tintoretto. Name, by the way, means little dyer. His father was a silk dyer. A lot of these artists came from middle class backgrounds and were elevated to status of rock stars because of the importance of art in Renaissance life and Renaissance culture. So, wasn't really sure whether I was going to include El Greco or not, uh, but I did have the request to include a little bit of Spain. So El Greco is a Mannerist painter. Sometimes we think of him also as an early Baroque painter, depending on the work. But his name, like I mentioned before, means the Greek. So he was a Greek painter who was born in a Venetian part or Venetian controlled part of the Greek islands. Didn't get much work in Italy, and he found himself employed in Spain. And a lot of his paintings can still be found in Spanish museums and also in frescoes in places like Madrid, and this one is in Toledo. El Greco was forgotten for hundreds of years, and then uh, in the 18th and the 1800s, the 19th century, and early 20th century, he was kind of rediscovered uh, and took on more importance in the artistic community. So this work is called "The Burial of the Count of Orgaz," who was an important patron of this church in Toledo. And so the central figure there at the bottom center of the composition, you see the dead body of the Count of Orgaz in his Charles V style suit of armor. He's being placed into the tomb by a young celebrant and the bishop, and the mourners look on in their finest attire, and then above the painting you see the Count being accepted into heaven. There's Mary seated at the right hand of God. There's St. Peter holding the keys to heaven and hell, and he's been taken up and has been greeted by Jesus and the saints. So an interesting composition by El Greco. But if we look at the body of the or the soul of El Greco, what is it called? It'll come to me. But the idea that the soul is now being taken up to heaven. Look at how elongated it is, and that's how we identify it as an example of mannerism. This one's called the disrobing of Christ. So the first thing that you're going to notice here is Christ's red robes and the beautiful color palette that El Greco uses, and the contrast of the red to everything else in the painting. What I like about this painting is the anachronism. So this is an important part of the New Testament where Jesus is about to be tortured and then executed, and all the soldiers are looking on. But those aren't first century AD soldiers. Those are 16th century AD Spanish soldiers wearing Spanish armor, carrying pikes and halberds and weapons that you would see in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, which is pretty cool. The contrast, too, is between the emotion, the serenity on Jesus's face, and then the anticipation and excitement on the face of the soldiers who are going to see something interesting, something that they want to see happen. They're about to take his robe off and then cast lots for it. They're going to gamble to see who gets to keep the clothes. Take a look at the figure immediately to Jesus's right, our left, if we're looking at the painting, and just take a look at his neck. So the craning of the neck and the stretching of the neck conveys this sense of he's so excited to get in on the act. But nobody's neck really looks like that. The neck itself, look at from the bottom of the earlobe to the clavicle. I mean, that guy's neck is twice the size of his head. So we're stretching out the neck here in an unrealistic way to convey a sense of emotion, to translate a religious message onto the canvas. Same thing look at the figure wearing the green. Just draw a line from his wrist to the top of where his shoulder would be. That's an unnaturally elongated arm, but we're doing that for a reason. So that is mannerism. So mannerism, we'll take the Renaissance and we'll stretch it. And that's our mannerism hack. If you'd like to talk more about Tintoretto or Pontormo, we certainly can do that. Let's have that discussion in the comments.